Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Tonight's presentation is on the onslaught of globalization. This issue came to the fore when I was walking through local retail outlets and looking at all the foreign manufactured goods. To young people, it must seem like the most natural thing in the world to walk through a Walmart, a Target, any of these retail outlets and not see a single American product made. I mean, this is very astonishing for older generations, however, because we remember when the United States was the economic giant of the world. It was an industrial titan. It manufactured everything. Everybody was clamoring for American goods and services, as late as the 1970s, 80s, 90s. To a lesser extent, it still exists somewhat in the technology field, where the United States is still, occupies a central position in innovation technology. But in manufacturing, the United States is, experienced a massive trade deficit, principally with third world countries, where we're having our markets flooded with their goods and services. But on the other side of it, they're not buying American products so much as they used to in the booming World War II era. And so I started wanting to go to the source, to the genesis of what was happening. And some of the conclusions are a little frightening. I don't mean to be alarmist, but as far back, I should say, as Plato's Republic, he says that democracy is the last stage before dictatorship. And he says it's a very organic process. And I was, studying the roots of that. And one of the economists that struck me was, one of the fathers of economics, the father of capitalism, Adam Smith. And he said something to the effect that the merchant class was the group most inclined to globalization and the least inclined to patriotism. They drive, the international conglomerates, the multinational companies that are not loyal to any one particular country. They'll see their interests rise or fall depending on, what legislation they can get passed in a multitude of different nations. So they're not really that loyal. They're not really that patriotic. And so they're the most given to, dealing with slave labor in third world countries, in Indonesia and China and, all these, Vietnam, for instance. And so the standards, the common standards of labor go down as this class gains more and more clout. And one of the things as well that most Americans don't realize is that our very tax system is also driving this very organic phenomenon. There's no conspiracy involved in this. I mean, we see democracies, as per Plato, degrade and decompose into fascist states. The Weimar Republic with Hitler, degrading into Nazi Germany, or the, monarchist Italy degrading into Mussolini's fascist Italy. So the process is very, very organic, sadly, and that's what makes it a lot scarier, because it's a lot harder to combat. And as I said, our tax system is partially to blame. Most Americans assume that their federal income taxes go to, pay the government, fund the government, and they couldn't be more wrong in that. The Grace Commission, which was set up by Ronald Reagan, looked into our taxation system, and they tracked the revenue streams. And they said, and this is a quote, "With 2/3 of everyone's personal income taxes wasted or not collected, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt and by federal government contributions to transfer payments. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services that most Americans assume come from their government." And so the government can't fund itself really through the money that they get, the pittance that they get from the citizens, and the corporations are paying less and less taxes. So how does the government on the federal level fund itself? And to learn that, we have to go back to the U.S. Constitution. In the Constitution, it says that the federal government will fund itself through tariffs, excise taxes, and duties. And this is how it funded itself all the way up until 1913, before the federal income tax kicked in, the Federal Reserve Act. And so, if you go to Washington, D.C., and you look at the White House, that was built without any federal income taxes whatsoever. You go to see the Washington Monument, once again, built without any federal income taxes whatsoever. All the parks, all the military installations, the bases, all of that was built before a federal income tax. So how did they do it? Well, according to the Constitution, as I said, the government funds itself through taxes, excise taxes, I should say, duties and tariffs. And so this is one of the driving factors behind the government wanting, to encourage globalization, to encourage foreign companies to compete in American markets, because with an American company, they'll be able to get tax money, okay, but less and less taxes as lobbyists become more successful at, getting the tax numbers down. So the government's getting less and less money from American companies. Through foreign companies, however, they get tariffs. For instance, if Nintendo wants to sell a game console in the United States and they sell that game console for, say, $200, right? And it goes onto the American markets, it's now $250, with that $50 going to fund the federal government. And you can appreciate quite quickly how much money that they're making from foreign companies when you look out onto American markets and you see Saabs and Hyundais and Kias and Toyotas, and you see all these cars, each one of which is generating a tariff that an American car wouldn't be. So the federal government is actually funding itself more through foreign companies. So this puts them in an odd position where they're championing foreign companies over American companies for the sole reason that they make more money off of it, And so you walk into a Walmart or a Target and everything is made in China or Indonesia or Vietnam. You walk in there and there's hardly, they've done exposés about that with Walmart. Walmart ironically started with a mandate that said that they would only sell American-made products, that they would back American industry. And once the founder of Walmart, Sam Walton, died, his family very quickly handed the keys over to the globalists, and everything in Walmart now is made in foreign countries. And they've done, as I said, exposés where they'll walk through Walmarts and they can't find 3 products made in the United States. So you have this inversion taking place. And it's driven, as I said, because there's more of an interest on the federal government level to make money off of tariffs than there is to back American companies, which are far less lucrative to the government. And this gets back to the tax system, as I said. We are driving this, ironically. The American citizen is driving this. There was a critic and philosopher from France at the foundation of America back in the 1700s named de Tocqueville, and he said, "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the majority discovers that it can vote itself largesse out of the public treasury. After the majority, discovers this, they'll always vote for the politician who will give them more benefits." So after that happens, de Tocqueville said, the democracy usually degrades into a dictatorship or a monarchy. It usually goes from democracy and then dictatorship, and then it'll even out into some kind of nepotistic monarchy. And so you realize that this is happening because the citizens themselves are, have been conned into accepting, the notion that, we need all these institutions, we need all these layers of bureaucracy. So the United States has fallen into this trap where we keep creating bloated entitlement programs and layers of bureaucracy that we really don't need. Consider the pensions and benefits that people in the alphabet soup agencies require, and consider the fact that throughout most of the United States' history, we didn't need any of these, alphabet soup agencies. When the United States' economy was booming in the post-World War II period, there was, no CIA, there was no NSA, there was no TSA, there was no DEA, there was no Department of Education, there was no, all these things, Homeland Security, all these layers of bureaucracy took root. Because, as Henry Adams said, he was a social critic. He was the grandson of John Quincy Adams, and his John Adams, the president. So he came from a distinguished and very well connected, Washington, D.C. family. And he said that bribery in Washington, D.C. takes place in the form of jobs. Politicians usually give cushy jobs to friends and cronies to pay them off for whatever, goods and services that they've provided to their campaigns or, what have you. In the last presidential cycle, George W. Bush got in trouble for giving a cushy job to his college roommate, Michael Brown. He was made the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and his prior qualifications were the fact that he was a judge in a dog show. So we have government at crucial points littered with, incompetent people who are unqualified, and yet they exist, these appointees, these cronies, all throughout, because bribery takes place in the form of jobs, but to pay for those jobs, to fund those jobs, the government now has to come up with revenue streams to do it. And we're all culpable in this, because none of us makes the connection between a closing American factory in a town and the government's trade policies. And ironically, when this happens, there's usually a contingent clamoring for more entitlement programs to help the unemployed. So ironically, what the government does to raise funds very quickly, rather than raise taxes, rather than cut spending, they usually try to get the cheap and easy method of getting more tariffs to raise quick money. It's almost like the heroin to the economic system. And the irony of this is the more clamoring for entitlements results in the beefing up of our, foreign goods flooding into the American markets, which results in the closing of American factories. Because how can they compete when the foreign companies are given favorable, considerations? When the foreign companies are using slave labor overseas, how can an American factory paying decent wages compete against that? And the answer is they can't. So then it ends up closing the American factories, which results in more unemployment, which results in the government, ironically, getting more tariffs from foreign goods, flooding the market with them. And it just happens, the cycle is just some crazy Groundhog Day depressing cycle, rinse and repeat, and after the 12th cycle of this, you look around over the economic landscape of the United States and you realize that the country has largely been gutted. And as I said, the driving force behind this is the call for more spending, more spending, more spending, more spending. This puts more pressure on the government, and it behaves like this with the predictable results. And we have to learn some measure of restraint. We have to bear in mind de Tocqueville's warning about democracy not being a permanent form of government, because once the average people discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury, they'll always vote for the politician who will promise them more and more benefits, which leads to more and more spending, which leads to more and more debt. And after that all happens, there's a tipping point, there's a critical mass where the society falls apart economically. It collapses, and there is always a strong man waiting in the wings to pick up the pieces. And there is always going to be a contingent of the population who will yearn for this father figure to put us back on the right track again. And this is how a free republic degrades into a dictatorship.